and children and families are being visited routinely, caseworkers are able to provide good representation of children in court. Court performance cannot be reduced to one number, and there is no standardized measure outcome. But good court performance helps ensure families receive the right support and children are able to achieve timely permanency. Poor court performance can mean children linger in the child welfare system longer than needed. CFS and DHHS legal team track when a court date is missed, whether a caseworker is unprepared, whether a case plan is delivered to the judge late or not at all, and whether the court order is out of compliance. CFS then requires a detailed review and mitigation plan from St. Francis. The department has also provided court guidance to St. Francis. The department will continue to pay close attention to an array of matrices to ensure the safety and well-being of children. My staff and I remain committed to serving children and families in the Eastern Service area and all across Nebraska. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I will now address your questions from the committee.
Thank you, Ms. Smith. And this morning, my questions are, I will attempt to organize them by topic, although I suspect your answers will cause us to jump around, so don't feel constrained to the topic. But I am going to begin this morning with some background questions. With your opening remarks, you mentioned that you joined the Nebraska Department of Health and Human Services, which I can guarantee I will shorten to DHHS or even just HHS this morning, so we know what we're talking about here. Prior to your joining that department on February 25th, 2019, what was your experience with child welfare?
Yes, I have over 25 years of experience. I've worked across the nation in terms of direct supervision as well as oversight supervision.
And at the time you joined DHHS as CEO, where did the Eastern Service Area contract stand? I know you mentioned, the January 9 date with the RFP, but who held the contract and what was the status of the RFP or the rebid?
Okay. At that time, Promise Ship was the contractor, and the RFP had already been launched, and I believe that date was January 9th, 2019.
I'm going to jump us back a little bit. What steps did you take to prepare for our hearing here this morning?
Well, I had an opportunity to read historically about privatization here in Nebraska from 2009. And then I also took a cursory review of the procurement manual.
Thank you. Did you, or to your knowledge, anyone at DHHS share or discuss the questions and topics that were provided to you in advance of this hearing with any representatives of St. Francis?
No, we have not.
And before this hearing, Ms. Smith, your office received requests for information from the LR29 committee through council. Are you aware of that?
Yes, I am.
And what did you especially, but also your office, do to identify, review, and then provide documents to the committee?
So once we received your request, my staff member who handles public record requests, the Office of Legislative Services, coordinated and disseminated the information to the needed divisions to be able to get you the information you needed back on time.
Thank you. Are you aware of any instances where what may have been responsive documents to the committee's requests were destroyed prior to those requests being received?
I am not aware of that occurring.
Do you believe that DHHS has fully cooperated with the committee's request for information?
Yes, I do.
All right, so moving on from kind of those background questions, I'm going to talk a little bit about the pre-bid or pre-RFP process. What role did HHS play in the development of the RFP?
Well, DHHS provided the technical support and expertise to the RFP process. The RFP, though, was already completed before I got here. And again, that was January of 2019.
But you understand that that HHS did provide technical support in the development of the RFP?
Yes.
In your first 6 months at HHS, what was your impression of the department's relationship with PromiseShip?
Prior to me arriving, I had a colleague who knew David Newell, and she was instrumental in introducing David and I. And I had hoped that that would begin a good working relationship, which I believe, it did while he was here. I also continued to work with the CEO who, after David left, was making the transition between PromiseShip and St. Francis. But when I got here, it was sensed that the relationship was strained, in that there was poor communication. I had heard also from stakeholders that there was concern that there was funding that was given to PromiseShip, and the results for children and families didn't meet the mark. But again, I tried very hard to work along with the leadership of PromiseShip, and I know that as best as possible, CFS did as well.
Ms. Smith, I think you just mentioned that you had heard that the results didn't meet the mark. Did you hear that within DHHS or from external stakeholders?
I would say, Ms. Jensen, that it was from both.
Thank you. Some more questions kind of in this area with respect to the relationship with PromiseShip. Did you have an understanding, I think you used the word strained, but whether it was a good partnership between PromiseShip and the state?
My sense was it was a strained partnership. A lot of it was based on poor communication. There was concerns around getting financial documents to understand how the spending was occurring. Those types of things was my understanding.
Thank you. Did you have an understanding about PromiseShip's view of the relationship and the partnership? Did you meet with them and gain an understanding of whether what I think the Stephen report characterized as a culture of distrust, whether that went both ways?
I think it went both ways. I think for the short time that David was here, I think we tried to figure out how at least we could get along, but it was strained.
So I'm going to jump us right into, and for the committee's sake, and for those of you listening, there are some topics that we're planning to cover with Ms. Smith and some topics that we're planning to cover with Mr. Botello. And so we're trying to be mindful of the time for the hearing today. And so if it seems as though I might be skipping something, I hope I'm not, but I don't intend to. So
Ms. Jensen, my voice is heavy and it's echoing. Is that a problem? Can people hear me okay?
I can hear you just fine.
Okay. I know my voice is heavy, and so sometimes
This room is difficult.
Okay. I just want to make sure that you don't think I'm not mindful.
It's fine for me. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can.
Fantastic. I'm going to jump us right into just the decision-making process on the RFP. What was your understanding of which agency bore the ultimate responsibility for the fairness, and I will also use the term legality, of the RFP process? Was that DAS or DHHS? It
was my understanding that DAS bore the responsibility of the procurement process.
Pardon me. What is the basis for that understanding?
I saw that in the manual.
Okay, so did you review the manual when you joined?
I did not.
So did you have I'll maybe just go back in time. When you joined the department as CEO, did you have an understanding then of who bore that responsibility?
I'm not sure I did.
And a similar question, although it is different, what agency, as between DAS and DHHS, did you understand bore the ultimate responsibility for making the award decision? Not for the process, but who was making the decision?
So DAS bears the responsibility of announcing the award. They have that responsibility of the award. DHHS made the recommendation to DAS about the award.
So I'm going to press you a little bit on that answer, if I may. So you said, I think, that DAS announced the decision. So is it fair to limit that to they were simply the communicator of the decision on a website to the public, or did they make the decision?
So what I'm saying is the final decision comes from DAS.
Okay.
DHHS makes the recommendation to DAS.
If I was going to use some maybe presidential terminology, where did the buck stop with respect to the decision? Was
Well,
it with DHHS or DAS?
The final decision rests with DAS. It was DHHS that made the recommendation to them.
Thank you. That's obviously a very important
Yes.
issue in our
Yes.
investigation, so I apologize for pressing you a little bit more there. And I'm going to do it one more time. Do you believe, and let me ask it differently, did you believe when you joined in that first 6 months that the buck stopped with you and DHHS on that decision, even if ultimately DAS was the technical decider?
Yes, I did.
Thank you. All right, so I'm going to move us on kind of to the RFP process. What steps did, and I am going to say you, but I would like you to answer on behalf of the department if you're able. Okay, so what steps did you as DHHS take to ensure that the department had done its due diligence into that decision, that recommendation ultimately to award the contract to St. Francis?
I'd like Ms. Jensen to name 4 steps that I believe the department took. The first thing that we did was we made sure that we used the DAS procurement manual and Nebraska statutes to guide our due diligence. The agency followed the process, and my central procurement office had the expertise, and they were working on making sure that that process was good. The second step that we took is we selected and we trained and evaluated a team consisting of DHHS team members, as well as stakeholders, external stakeholders, who were going to actually do the review and make sure that they understood their role and responsibility for reviewing the proposal. A group of DHHS finance teammates conducted oral interviews as well with each of the bidders to examine their financial management. After scoring, DHHS ordered a media review for the highest scoring bidder, and that was St. Francis. And then finally, DHHS conducted an on-site financial review on-site at St. Francis in Salina, Kansas on September 16, 2019.
Thank you. So I think you just answered this, but specifically as to St. Francis, you mentioned the on-site review.
Yes.
You mentioned, I think more generally, the oral interviews, which occurred with all of the, both, I should say,
Yes,
both of the
that's
bidders.
correct.
Anything else specific to St. Francis's financial situation that the department did other than what you've already mentioned?
This is all I can think of for right now.
Maybe I can jog your memory with another question, or maybe another thought or concept with another question. What due diligence, if any, did DHHS do with respect to St. Francis's performance, in particular with finances in other states?
We did not look at any other performance issues. We went solely by the RFP that they gave us, which was their work history, their performance, how they felt they did in other states. Now, one thing I would say, Ms. Jensen, is that we had a history with St. Francis from 2012. And they serve many of our constituents over to the western part of the state. We had not had any problems with performance or finances. As part of the review of the process, I know that staff reviewed as part of their bid, their financial records as well. That was done as part of the process.
And just for clarity of the record, the experience that the state had with St. Francis in the western part of the state was that was not case management experience though, correct?
No, it wasn't. I think they provide, family support work. But yet again, they are licensed as a child placing agency, and our relationship with them was good, and there weren't any concerns at that time.
I'm going to try to clarify the time frame of that on-site review that you did with St. Francis. I think you mentioned that was, maybe you didn't mention the time, but that was in September of 2019.
That's right, that's right.
And so that was after the intent to award.
That is correct.
And actually, was it after even the contract was signed?
No, it was after the contract was signed, I believe.
It's not a gotcha. I won't try to trick you here. My information is that the contract was signed on July 3rd,
Right,
2019.
that's right.
So that financial on-site review occurred after.
That is correct.
I'm going to ask you about what has been termed, I think, in other briefings, a media review that was done with respect to St. Francis. Are you familiar with that term?
I am, yes.
And as I understand it, so that we're on the same page, there was maybe a packet of information that had been collected with what maybe my grandmother would call clippings, newspaper clippings, and other information provided of, I think it's fair to characterize issues that St. Francis had had with performance, from everything from, kids sleeping on floors, I think Mr. Kenny talked about earlier this year, to maybe some financial issues. So we're talking about the same media review packet, right? Have you seen this?
I have not seen it.
Okay, you've never seen the St. Francis media review packet that was provided to HHS in the RFP process?
I have not seen that.
Oh, okay. Then I probably don't have a lot of questions for you about it. But I think my question is, I'm going to ask it anyway. Assuming what I just said is true, that there was a media review and a packet prepared, whether you've seen it or not, do you have any information about what led to that media review being prepared? Okay.
Okay.
Why don't you talk about what led to that?
Yeah, it's just good business practice to do a media review of somebody that you're contracting with. The media review packet that I saw did not raise anything that would suggest that there was something substantial going on. And to be honest with you, Ms. Jensen, I look for things that point to harm of a child. The media review that we did, I did not see the things that you are stating to me. So that's why my face looks the way it does.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for clarifying.
And just to add, in a media review, I've not only done it for contractors, but when I'm going to employ executives, I've done it for them as well. It's just good practice.
So maybe a sort of informal background check?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you know who at HHS analyzed the media review packet once it was provided?
So DHHS ordered a media review on the highest score bidder. DHHS, and this is my team, we collaborated and looked at the media review. The former director of communications is the one that did it for us.
And who is that? Do you know that person's name?
Matthew Litt.
Within HHS, understanding that maybe my characterization you don't agree with in terms of that media review, but with the media review that you saw, did you personally have any concerns with St. Francis?
I did not at that time.
After the media review was, performed and disclosed after the media review was performed, did you come to understand that St. Francis was having significant issues in Kansas with its case management?
I did not know.
At the time I'm just going to say in 2019, so I'll limit us to 2019, were you aware of a class action lawsuit that had been filed against St. Francis with respect to its, a number of things, but including its case management?
I think I might have heard about that.
Okay. Was there any discussion within HHS about that class action? Is it related to the award to St. Francis?
I don't think so.
Okay. I'm going to take us back to that decision to award to St. Francis now again. So we talked about, I think already, that it was DAS who ultimately, communicated that and was the decider. Do you know who? And so instead of saying DAS, do you know who at DAS ultimately was the final decision maker?
I do not know.
Did you understand that there was a person who made that decision?
I don't think so. I thought it was just the department.
Okay. Did you come to understand that Promise Ship had filed a protest with respect to that? Okay. How did you learn that a protest had been filed?
I think through the general counsel.
Of HHS?
Yes.
Mr. Botello? Okay. What input did HHS have, whether that was you or anyone in HHS, to deny that Promise Ship protest?
Well, the protest was worked through with my central procurement team. That's who worked with DAS on the protest.
Okay, so I'm trying to just get a little bit more detail,
Okay.
On kind of how that worked, for lack of a better term, right? What input DHS was really giving to DAS, and we've seen some communications between, I think it's Walklin, Mr. Greg Walklin at DHHS and Annette Walton at DAS, where there was, for instance, a draft letter provided by your department to them, which would have denied the protest. So I'm trying to get a feel for, was that denial of the protest really a recommendation and really it sounds pejorative and I don't mean it that way, but a shadow decision within HHS that then was given to DAS?
I don't believe so.
Okay, tell me a little bit more.
Yeah, the way I take it, Ms. Jensen, is that the two departments were working together.
Okay.
That's how I take it.
Okay, so your understanding was really that was a joint effort.
Well, again, DAS has the sole responsibility to respond to the protest. What you hear me saying is that I believe that my department was providing them the necessary information to make the decision.
That's helpful.
That's what I want to communicate.
Are you familiar with that communication between Mr. Walklin and Ms. Walton that I referenced? It was in June of 2019.
I don't think so.
Within HHS, well, let me ask it this way. I think you testified earlier that it was your view that ultimately DHHS made that recommendation to award to St. Francis.
Yes.
Was that your recommendation as CEO?
It was.
So what advice, I'm not asking for legal advice here, but what advice from all of the teams you've been mentioning to us this morning did you receive from within your department regarding whether the state should award that contract to St. Francis?
I think we made sure that we understood the scoring, how we got to the scoring, that they indeed could do the job that was being requested of them. There were multiple conversations about it. But again, we went with the organization that had the highest score.
I don't want to simplify it too much. Is it fair to say that the decision really just came down to the score? It was who's got the highest score, that's who we'll pick?
I wouldn't say that.
Okay.
I would say that there was great thought, there was great discussion and thought that went into it.
Okay. So in addition to the score, and you said great thought and deliberation, and again, I'm just trying to get as much detail as we can. What other things were considered specifically, relating to that recommendation other than the score?
Well, I think again, we looked at the financials, the oral interviews that each one of them did. And we really tried to make a good decision in terms of who we thought who could serve children and families. And I'm sorry if it looks like I'm scathing, but I'm not.
No, not at all, not at all. It's my job just to get into the details. Maybe the committee already thinks I'm too into the details, so you all can stop me anytime, but I'm trying to get as much information as we can as we move toward, the committee's final report here. So what about other stakeholders? Forget about what information you received within your department. Did you receive input from other stakeholders relating to the decision to recommend St. Francis?
Yes, I did. I got a lot of feedback after the award.
Okay, so after the intent to award, I would suggest external stakeholders who are
Yes.
providing. Okay.
Yes.
Tell me kind of, if you can, generally what that input was.
There was concern about whether or not they could indeed do the work for the bid price in their proposal.
Okay, and we are definitely moving into that, so you have led me segue perfectly. So let's talk about what I think it's fair to say is a significant difference in cost between the bids of St. Francis and Promise Ship, which you will agree were the only two bidders in this process, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so what did you understand to be the rationale for how St. Francis could achieve a cost that was essentially 40% below the cost, the actuals that Promise Ship had been, providing?
Each bidder provided a bid based on their own technical response to the proposal. DHS would be unable to determine if St. Francis bid was too low or Promise Ship's was too high. At that time, there was no thought or belief that St. Francis just could not do the job. That was the number that they put in the bid, and we believed that they could do the work.
Okay, so with respect to that difference, did you personally have knowledge of the Stephen Group's report and findings with respect to Promise Ship's costs at the time of the bid?
Not at that time, because I think I got the Stevens Group report later.
Okay.
Their final report, I think, was in May or something like that.
Oh, okay, so at the time, well, let me step back. And I'll ask it more generally. At the time of seeing those two bids and seeing such a stark difference, HHS did not question whether St. Francis could do the task at hand for the cost provided?
Remember I said earlier, there was a lot of discussion.
Okay.
There was a lot of discussion as to whether they could or not.
When you review, it sounds like you did eventually review the Stephen Group's report.
Yes.
Did that impact your view of Promise Ship's costs or St. Francis's costs?
It didn't at that time.
Did you believe at the time of the intent to award that promise ship, and you, I mean the department, okay, so not, I might ask for your personal view as well, but did the department believe that promise ship was being overpaid?
I think there were times where that was a thought.
When you testified before, I believe it was just the HHS committee and not also the LR 29 committee in January of this year, you, I believe, talked about the audit report that the state auditor's office had put out in 2018. Was that considered as part of the RFP award to St. Francis?
I don't think so.
Did you have an understanding at HHS that the St. Francis award the St. Francis bid, the RFP response, was somehow taking into account the Families First Act, as we call it? That there would be some synergies provided, or maybe some change in services that might come about as a result of that federal law?
Yes.
Okay, can you talk about that a little bit?
And I'll be honest with you, Ms. Jensen, I can't go into great detail, but I know that the former director, Matt Wallen, and Lori Harder were prepared to work alongside with St. Francis on some of the new and innovative programs that we would have to administer as part of FFPSA.
And understanding maybe your information is a little limited by your intro there on your last answer, but did you have an impression of whether either St. Francis or Promise Ship was taking into account the Families First legislation with respect to its bid response?
I don't know. And I guess the question that I'm answering, Ms. Jensen, is that I know that once the award occurred, my staff worked alongside of St. Francis to make sure that they knew that part of their responsibility was the FFPSA. That's really what I'm trying to communicate. I'm sorry.
No, thank you for being clear. So I'm gonna ask a few questions here about the transition from Promise Ship to St. Francis. Who ultimately made the decision to expedite the transition of cases from Promise Ship to St. Francis? And I will use my words, that was expedited, right? From January 2020 as expected to October 2019. Who made that decision?
I made that decision.
Why?
I made that decision because I wanted to make sure that we were transitioning 1,500 children over time. Also, Promise Ship at the time was losing staff. And so it was trying to create a balance between the staff at Promise Ship and then transitioning the cases over to St. Francis. Ms. Jensen, what I didn't want to have happen is that we would lose kids in the transition. So every week we staffed, my staff, Promise Ship, and St. Francis, they staffed approximately 250 to 280 children every week by worker, by team of cases, to ensure that each child moved over to St. Francis in a timely manner and that there was somebody there to receive them. Here's what I've experienced in my career. I've had situations when I was a private and both when I was in government where a private agency may have failed and the state says, well, you're going to take the cases. They would give us a cascade of cases, 200, 500 cases, sometimes 700 cases, and tell us your contract starts in January, you start with case management. But by the time I get all the cases, I don't know where the kids are. I don't know if the kids are safe. The paperwork is in disarray. I didn't want St. Francis to start off that way. I had the responsibility of 1,500 children in Eastern Service Area. I wanted to make sure that 1,500 children got to St. Francis in the right way. particularly after we were losing staff. And in addition to that, thank God I did that, because February and March of that year, the pandemic started.
So what was, at the time, thank you for that very robust answer there, Ms. Smith. What, at the time that you made that decision, what was the status of the statutorily required readiness assessment? Right, at the time the first case transferred, what was the status of that readiness assessment?
Well, the readiness assessment was still in place, it was still in progress, but here's what we did, Ms. Jensen. We tried to make sure that the following areas were completed, and these are all around safety issues for kids, because we wouldn't have moved if they hadn't got these things in area done. Safety and best interest of the child, the family well-being, and case stability. Again, we did the phased approach so that we could make sure that we could account for each child, and that we did it with good thought and intention. That was the whole purpose of doing it. The remaining items that had to be done for the readiness assessment had more to do with documentation, and some business acumen things. But the safety issues, we wanted to make sure those were taken care of first.
Did this, understanding your last answer, did the status of the readiness assessment and review impact that transition of cases one way or the other?
Yeah, I don't believe it did. I felt like it really set St. Francis up for success, to be honest with you. We were monitoring them with that readiness assessment all during the transition.
I don't mean this as an argumentative question, but
No.
I think St. Francis would, perhaps based on what we've seen over the last few weeks especially, would disagree, right, that they were set up for success. So I'll give you an opportunity to maybe respond to that.
Yeah.
Right? That the decision you made to expedite the case transfer was intended to set them up for success. Do you believe it did?
I believe it did, and let me tell you why. There are two factors in child welfare that can set up the demise of a child welfare agency. Number one, not having enough and appropriate paperwork in order and having it organized. That's number one. And then the second one is the loss and responsibility of children under their care. The reason why we did that early transition, and I don't know if I would call it expedited, but okay, early transition, is because, again, I did not want them to start in January with 1,500 cases and not have an understanding of where each one of those children lie. And that's why we did it. Failure, I have seen and I have experienced in my own career, boxes of cases that come over, foster parents haven't been talked to, children haven't been talked to, you have a disaster. I believe us doing that transition early set St. Francis up for success, at least in the short term.
Thank you. Ms. Smith, I am going to kind of bounce back to a little bit more discussion on the cost differentials between the two bids, and just maybe try to get down to a little bit more detail in terms of just your knowledge. I know we're going to speak with Mr. Botello about this during his testimony as well, but maybe just some general questions. Do you agree that the RFP at least allowed the department to review bids for reasonableness of cost?
Yes.
And I'll ask you another kind of foundational question. Do you believe that the department or the state is obligated to actually perform a sort of reasonableness assessment with respect to cost?
Yes.
What does reasonable in this context mean to DHHS, right? And maybe let me just, I'll stop there. What does reasonable mean in this context of comparing these two bidders that are 40%, different?
I think looking at both of the proposals, seeing where there's differences, and whether or not it's an actual cost.
Okay. Are you aware of what criteria, if any, that the department, DHHS, applied relating to reasonableness of these two bids?
My understanding was certainly the scoring of the bids, but also the oral interviews was a way to really look at the finances. Not necessarily the bids, but the finances. That's my understanding.
So in those reviews of the finances that you just described, how did you come to understand that it was indeed reasonable for St. Francis to be able to provide the services detailed in their RFP for the price they told you they were going to do it for?
I had no reason at that time to believe that they couldn't do the work. We accepted the information that both of them provided, and we went with the organization that was the highest score for that particular bid. At that time, I had no reason to believe that they couldn't do it.
One last question with respect to the case transition, and I don't mean this question to be insulting in any way, but was there any discussion or correlation, or I could think of maybe several other words, but between the decision to expedite cases and the promise ship litigation and what impact those transitions would have?
No, it was simply about safety of children. It had nothing to do with the litigation at all. I was just trying to make sure that we were accounting for children and doing it correctly.
Just a few more questions before I turn the questioning over to Chairman Arch and the committee. When you were here in January of this year, and I think I have captured it accurately in my quote, but if your testimony is sitting to your right, you testified that we did not know it was underbid. We're speaking for the department. And that no one at DHHS knew that it was underbid. Do you remember?
Yes, I remember that.
After 10 months of your own investigation, probably with the help of the committee sort of forcing you to do your own investigation, do you still believe that is true? That no one at DHHS knew that this contract had been underbid?
I don't believe that we knew.
Do you believe today, again, a lot more knowledge since January, do you believe today that someone, anyone at DHHS at least suspected that St. Francis had underbid, particularly in consideration of that additional $15.1 million request and that clarification meeting? Do you think it's fair that maybe someone in the department suspected there was an underbid situation?
I think we had a lot of discussion about it. That's what I would say to you, Ms. Jensen. There was a lot of discussion. I can't necessarily pinpoint that there was one person that said, stop.
Okay, thank you for your candor there. I'm gonna ask maybe just one more question in this area, because some, and I think I would consider myself in this group with the work that I have been doing as special counsel, find it just somewhat unbelievable that, and I really mean that in the true sense of the word, the literal sense of the word unbelievable, that nobody at DHHS knew or suspected or thought, wow, this contract looks really underbid. And we've had this meeting and they asked for more money and then they magically didn't ask for more money. So I just would like to give you an opportunity to respond to folks, frankly, like me, who really are sitting in the chair thinking, how did you at DHHS really not know, not suspect, not think about this?
I think we were so busy following the procurement process. And again, we were trying to make sure, Ms. Jensen, let me go back. There had been a failed RFP process back in 2017, okay, where things had gotten thrown out. I think we were so conscientious in trying to follow the procurement process and make sure that we followed everything to the letter of the law. That's what I think really happened.
Yeah, thank you for that candor. So with that, I don't have any questions at this point. I'm going to turn the questioning over to Chairman Arch. I know he's got some questions, and then he'll allow the committee to ask theirs. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for being here and for your candor in these responses. I want to take my questions are perhaps on a broader perspective, a little bit of a higher level. One of the things that we heard in our first hearing when we talked about history of DHHS and procurement predates you by 10 years, but we saw that there has been a history of decision making that has gone through those 10-year periods, where back to the MMIS and some of the failed RFPs and some of the decisions on Wipro and all of those decisions. I think the committee's heard in that testimony and was concerned that there is a pattern. And when we see something like that, we say, well, if that's the case, names change, dates change, it's not related to one particular person in all of this. We, of course, start talking about process. We talk about, do we have a decision-making process in statute, in the procurement manual, that supports good decision-making? And I don't think it's unreasonable for us to ask that question. And I guess I'd like your thoughts on that. You said that this, you were very focused on the process of the procurement and following that and making sure, which I'm not surprised, because in the past when that wasn't done, then there were lawsuits and all the rest. So we like to avoid those. Does our current procurement process support good decision-making from your perspective?
I think the procurement process supports, as best as it can, the services that we try to procure. That's what I think. I think it supports the best process possible.
Okay. And I guess, we're going to continue to question that and try to understand that, because of course the history,
Senator Art, here's what's different. Wipro, MMIS, those are all technology. And I think what we are doing is also having a procurement process that tries to meet the needs of human services. And so, again, I think we were so driven on following the process.
Right.
Okay. Right.
And I would tell you, from the perspective of the committee, as we take a look at it, if that's what we say brought us to this decision, which 2020 hindsight, retrospect and looking back, you say, well, had we known, perhaps it would have been a different decision. But if the process brought us there, then we'll continue to examine the process if that's what brought us there. Because we don't, of all the things that we as a committee want to make sure in the future, is we want to make sure that our process supports good decision-making. And that's, so that we don't find ourselves in investigative committees and looking back at decisions. I have one question on clarification. In your opening remarks, and this is totally unrelated to some of this, but in your opening remarks, you referenced the probationary license that has been issued now for St. Francis. You said the probationary period ends November 30, 2021. Can you explain what that means? It ends regardless of whether they clear deficiencies, or, what does that mean?
Yes, it just simply means that by that time, we hope that they're in full compliance. and that we'll be evaluating next steps.
Okay.
That's what that means.
Next step could be the extension of a probationary period with restrictions as it is now. Next step, what?
Senator Archer, I'm going to be honest with you, I don't know at this point, but what we are committed to doing is to see where they are and that they're at compliance
Okay,
by that time.
okay.
You know, one comment I wanted to make to you about the White Pro and all of that.
Yeah.
I think one thing that is a lesson learned for DHHS is that certainly would have done a better job at the beginning of our RFP process. And what I mean by that is, and I'm a part of this whole situation, I think our RFP process could have led to how we looked at the procurement in a way, and that would have forwarded us differently.
And is that in the scoring? Is there anything in particular?
Yeah, so what I'm really referencing is that as I've kind of went over this in my head, and as you know, sought resolution about this from a leadership perspective. There was a need to do a couple of things in my mind, you know, and to really enhance. Wasn't here when the RFP was launched. Probably would have done the RFP different, but I wasn't here. And that's nothing against the leadership that was here. But had we done some visioning around what was it that we were planning to do with this new RFP, since we had one in 2017 that failed? What was the practice model going to look like? What were we going to be asking people throughout the state or the Eastern Service area to do? What were they going to perform? How were they going to do the practice? You know, we in child welfare do family-centered practice. And so who does that? Who participates in the practice? And then the third is kind of a fiscal model. How do we pay for that? And then the fourth is, once you have the vision of child welfare, once you have the practice model for child welfare and the finance model, now I can put my RFP together and figure out, does that RFP match the procurement?
Okay.
So there's some ways that I would have
helpful.
thought differently.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but what I hear you saying is that RFP, once that RFP is set, you follow the, that's the document.
In this instance, Senator Arch, we followed it.
Right.
Okay.
And so if it's a bad RFP, then the process continues, and you may get to the end where there were several options, I think, that you had at the end, where you could, and that has occurred with other contracting efforts where you pull it back, you put an emergency extension, you have a number of options at the end, but once that RFP starts, it drives it. Okay. So I also want to hear your comments on how we are structured within government and the role of DAS and in your particular case, the role of DHHS, but DAS, of course, applies to other agencies in our state government as well. They are the procurement, they are the technical experts. As I read the procurement manual, I understand that it is at the discretion of the department whether or not to use DAS in some of these purchases. You can do that within the department. In this particular case, I know that it occurred before you were here, but the decision was made to use DAS. Am I correct in that understanding?
That is correct. And I thought there was a dollar amount that triggered us working with DAS.
Okay.
And so that occurred.
Okay. All right. And as you have testified that the relationship is that you make recommendations, DAS is that final decision making, but from what I heard your testimony to be is that honestly, if DHHS recommends, DAS needs a good reason not to approve?
I don't think I quite said that.
No, I
I
understand you
think,
did.
I think what I said was, we make the recommendation and they make the ultimate decision.
Okay, all right, okay. Do you think that the RFP as it was issued, do you think that was part of the issues right now that even St. Francis faces in their ability to be successful in this contract? Does the RFP set them up for success? Did the RFP hinder them? Did that have an impact on their performance, how the RFP was written and drafted?
So I wouldn't say that, Senator Arch. I would say that perhaps we weren't, there has to be extreme clarity. And sometimes in organizations, I'm going to speak to the past because I wasn't here
Right.
for the development of the RFP, but I know in other RFPs, there is a lot of clarity of what the expectation is. And here's what I mean by that. What are we purchasing? What are we buying? What are we asking for that vendor to do for the department? It seems oftentimes in my previous experiences, we have defined that for the vendor, and the vendor decides whether or not they can actually do the work. We don't allow the vendor to tell us whether they can, whether they can't. We define that. There's some things that we want to have accomplished that supports children and families, that supports the practice. And so we're asking the vendor, can you do the work that we need to get done? Here's what we want to buy. So I think RFPs have to provide a level of clarity and understanding so that the bidder understands what they're getting into.
Yeah, I think, thanks, that's helpful. You mentioned the term vendor, and that's something else that we've been discussing within the committee is this relationship in the Eastern Service area. Do you characterize that as a vendor relationship? Do you characterize that as a sub-grantee? I know that there has been discussion, and we've had these discussions amongst ourselves where you as a state cannot delegate the responsibility of providing care. That rests with the state. CMS makes that, I think, very clear. What is that relationship to this entity, St. Francis Ministry? How would you characterize that relationship?
The relationship should be almost an appendage.
In a what?
Appendage to
Okay,
the department.
okay,
It is working in our stead. It is working on behalf of us. The ability to see the vision of the department. And that's why, as I said in my past experiences, the vision of what child welfare and the services and the practices that are needed are very clear in that RFP process, so that that subcontractor understands the role that they have under the guise of the state and in partnership as appropriate or as possible that it can be. That role has to be clearly defined.
From what I hear you saying, it sounds as though that relationship is certainly more than an independent contractor, but they stand in the shoes of the state in providing those services. Is that a fair?
They stand in the shoes with us. So example, when I was in Chicago, I was a private provider there. DCFS, Department of Children and Family Services, was the state. And we did a lot of work for the state on their behalf. But I was a subcontractor, but I knew that I was an appendage to them, that I spoke sometimes for them in the work that we did.
Yeah.
Now, I couldn't go out the guise of it, but I spoke many times for them in the work that I was doing in child welfare.
That sounds like a very difficult relationship to maintain, to establish, to maintain, to be successful. Is that mischaracterization, or is
I
that?
think as I said earlier, in my previous experiences, it has to be clearly defined. And again, it goes back to what are we purchasing? It has to be clearly defined. And the accountabilities have to be clearly defined. And there has to be good communication between that state or government entity with its subcontractor.
Yeah, this sounds like a different relationship than simply the purchasing of services.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, I have one closing question, but I want the committee to also have an opportunity here. I do have one other question. Knowing what you know now, would your recommendation be the same?
No, I do not believe that we would come to the same recommendation. I probably, and I've already shared it, I would take a different approach on the RFP.
Okay.
Totally different approach.
Okay, all right. I'll pause there. I just have one last question, but if the committee has any questions, we can ask those at this point. Okay, Senator McKinney, you please.
Thank you for your testimony. I think I have a couple questions, but the first, through the process of deciding who to pick between Promise Ship and St. Francis, what didn't the department like about Promise Ship, and what did you like about St. Francis that Promise Ship didn't have?
I don't know if it was necessarily a like, it was truly looking at the score. I don't want to make this be that it was a personal decision between the department and Promise Ship. I don't think it was that at all. It was looking at the proposals in their totality.
Okay, so my second question, do you think the scoring system is flawed?
You know, in all procurement processes, there's opportunities to strengthen.
If you could strengthen it, what would you do if you had authority to make that recommendation?
Well, what I said, to Senator Archer's question, I would go all the way back to the beginning, Senator McKinney, because I really would like to have taken a different look at the RFP process, which I think could have informed how we procure.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Coulterman?
Thank you, Senator Arch, and thank you for testifying today. My staff and I have been doing a lot of work on the procurement process, and as a result, we've done a very deep dive into what's transpired with this particular contract. We're talking about a $197 million contract over a 5-year period, which is not chump change to the state of Nebraska. It's an expensive item. But I was troubled a little bit, and correct me if I'm wrong, when you started out, when you first gave your testimony this morning, I believe you indicated that you had put together a team inside the HHS to evaluate the contracts, what to look for, what not to look for. And that team made the recommendations to you. Is that an accurate statement?
So what I was saying is that we had a team of evaluators. They included people from the department and some key stakeholders who evaluated the proposals.
And I believe that.
And there was some training attached to that.
Okay, and I believe you also indicated that one of the individuals, I think you said his name was Matthew Litt, was a communications director at the time. Was he on that committee?
I don't think so.
Okay, but then you also indicated that he had done a media review?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so that media review, did that become part of the evaluation that you had? Now, you indicated you didn't read the media review. Is that
Not the
accurate?
ones that she indicated.
The
We
media,
did one. The department did one.
you authorized a media review
Yes,
as
sir.
a department, is that correct?
Yes,
And did you review that?
yes.
Okay, so in that media review that and I've looked through all the information as
Yes.
well, it showed multiple times that hundreds of children had been house at their corporate offices in Kansas over a period of time. I think it was 600 during a 6-month period. Do you remember reading that?
I didn't read that.
When you got the media review, who did you share that with? Did that become part of the process?
Well, I shared it with our team.
That team that
Yeah,
you talked
no,
about?
not the evaluation team, it was the DHHS team, not the
Okay.
evaluators. The evaluators only dealt with scoring the proposals.
Is it troubling to you? And again, maybe I'm doing too deep a dive into this, but is it troubling to you that they would house kids in their corporate offices in Kansas? And again, my information shows there was about 600 kids over a 6-month period. Do you approve of that type of?
So this is what I would say to you, Senator Coachman. No, I don't approve of that, but I know instances, even in my career, where that has happened.
Is that going on with our current process here in
Absolutely
Nebraska?
not.
Okay.
But I do know that it occurs from time to time in child welfare systems when they are not able to find good placement.
Having read that media review, do you think that there could have been more due diligence before awarding this contract? I mean, $197 million contract.
You know, Senator Coachman, there's always opportunities to improve.
Okay, then I want to move a little bit into the contracting process itself. And we don't have a lot of, our procurement process doesn't allow for a lot of appeals. So it's up to if someone wants to appeal something in our state, they have to bring a lawsuit. So I'm going to ask this chronological question. Did you know that the contract with St. Francis was signed during the protest process?
I wasn't aware of that.
And that actually happened before Promise Ship had gotten an opportunity to meet with DAS. So the contract was signed prior to that. Did you authorize the signing of the contract before the protest process was finished?
I don't think I did.
Okay. Did you know that Promise Ship, the other bidder, had asked DAS to stay the execution of the contract until after the protest process was finished?
I think I was aware of that.
Why didn't we wait?
I don't have an answer for that, sir.
Did you think that the protest had no merit?
Oh, no, I didn't feel that.
Okay. And finally, did you make the decision, or did DAS make the final decision to award prior to the protest being completed?
And ask that again, I'm sorry.
Did you make the decision, or did DAS make the decision to award the contract prior to the protest being completed?
No, I think we thought we were just following the process. And again, we made the recommendation to DHHS and they make the final decision.
Okay. And then, and this is just, and I don't know if this is a fair question or not, but when you're dealing with, I mean, we're talking about two different departments here. We're talking about DAS and DHHS. During the period of time that we award contracts of this magnitude, I mean, it's a large contract, it affects a lot of people. Are you in contact with the governor's office to get any input from them, one way or another, on contracts of this nature?
No, I was not.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Other questions? Senator Kavanaugh?
Thank you. Thank you so much, CEO Smith, and I'll ask my questions slowly so you can take a sip of water. I appreciate all of your answers to legal counsel's questions. I just had two clarifying questions.
Okay.
You mentioned that you had conversations about the contract and the costs before with your internal team, and that no one said that you shouldn't move forward with it. But did anyone express actual concerns over the costs?
There was discussion about both,
Okay.
Senator Kavanaugh. There was discussion about both.
Does that mean that there were concerns expressed over the cost of the St. Francis bid?
I don't want to say concerns, but
What would
we
you say?
discussed, yeah, we just discussed both proposals.
How would you describe that discussion then, if not concerns?
Just making sure that we were following the process and doing what we needed to do.
Okay. And then Senator McKinney had asked you a question about the RFP process and the decision-making about the score. And you said it was based on the score. And I'm not sure if you had read Mr. Wallen's deposition during the, he stated that there is always a concern over doing a transition like this and the impact it has on the stability of the children. Were there conversations about that, especially since I assume was Mr. Wallen part of those conversations with your team?
Yes.
Was that expressed at that time about whether or not you should be transitioning just purely based on the score, considering the disruption to the children?
No.
Okay, thank you.
Senator McKinney.
Thank you, Senator Arch. I just had two quick questions that I meant to ask earlier. Do you think the state should be doing the case management, or should a private entity like St. Francis be doing it?
Well, I think privatization has its place in child welfare. I think it really depends on, again, identifying, providing clarity on what the role is going to be. So I still think that there's opportunities for privatization to be done.
Would you, in your opinion, would you say this pilot has been successful or a failure? And depending on your answer, do you think the pilot should be ended and the state should take over and assume the responsibility of taking care of these kids?
I don't know that I could say that right now. Again, I'm gonna go back to my first question, the first question that you asked me, and that is, I think there's roles for private vendors, private subcontractors to help us do the work here in the state. It's just really clearly defining what their role is and what the expectations are and whether they can do the work.
If it was ended, do you think the state could do a better job?
Child welfare is difficult, be it the state doing it or a private provider, but again, it's really itemizing the roles and responsibilities so that everybody can be successful, both the private contractor and the state.
All right, thank you.
Any final questions? Senator Williams.
Thank you, Chairman Arch, and thank you for being here, and thank you for taking care of our kids and trying to do this well. I think we are all here today trying to analyze and strengthen the process that we have gone through. And there's one piece of that that still, when I hear the questions that we've had and the responses, that I still is fuzzy to me in this process. Several times you said you believe St. Francis could do the job, I think was your, and in looking at the information that they sent. I think you looked at the performance that they had in other situations. You analyzed their financial position. You looked at the media information. I know we have two different sets of media information maybe on that. But the part as the banker in me continues to go back to the question of where in this process, yes, they can do the job, but where in the process does the price tag that they are going to be paid for doing this job come into that decision?
And I think it did. And I think the decision we made was based on the score, that we would score it to the person that had the highest score. I think we tried to work well with DAS, and we do work well with DAS around the procurement process, but I think that's where the rubber hits the road.
In the scoring process, is the weighting in such a way that the final price tag outweighs other performance factors?
I can't remember. I don't think
That's
so.
something I would be interested in to see
Yeah.
how that is.
Yes,
Again,
yes.
looking to building a process that
Right.
is successful for this long term. Thank you.
Yes.
Any other questions? I guess just one final question, and that is, I just want to make sure that you have the opportunity to, if there's something else that you want to share with us, we haven't asked you in the questions, or you didn't provide in your opening remarks, that would assist us in our investigation and our understanding. As I mentioned at the opening remarks, that's why we're here, is understanding. And if there's anything else, we want to give you that opportunity.
Well, I think I started on it when Ms. Jensen asked me the question. And, I'd like to flip the conversation to what opportunity we have to really look at a path forward. And I talked about 5 things. One was really having a good vision for what child welfare needs to look like in Nebraska. And I'm not sure that we do. My staff, through Stephanie Beasley, has begun to do some work on strategic planning. But one of the things that we do need to have here is a good vision of what does child welfare look like in Nebraska. How do we plan to serve the most vulnerable families here? And I'm not sure that we have that. I think that our stakeholders have one view, our providers have another view, our judiciary have another view, but it's not a single view that all of us can wrap around and say, this is how we serve families in Nebraska. And one such example where I thought that work was done very well, and it happened shortly after I got here, was with Senator Williams and my Medicaid long-term care. We had our legislators, we had our providers, and we had DHHS around the table figuring out what was going to be the price tag for long-term care fees, I think at the time. And I thought that was a wonderful model to have this discussion. The second thing is really looking at that practice model. How do we say that we serve families that are at the attention of child welfare? I don't think that that's designed here. We use what is called safety organized practice, but I'm not sure that everybody who touches a vulnerable family understands safety organized practice and what they should see in the courtroom, what they should see in a home visit, what they should see when they're talking to a CASA. I don't know that the system knows the practice of how we serve children and families here. And one of the successes that I had in Mecklenburg County was from the county manager's office all the way down to the frontline staff. Everybody knew family-centered practice, and they knew what it looked like. The judges knew, our CASAs knew, our probationary folks knew, the attorneys for the department knew, the parents' attorneys knew. Everybody was educated on this is how we serve children in Mecklenburg County in North Carolina. I don't think that we all share that view. And I think sometimes there's blaming instead of figuring out how we can get around the table. The third thing is having a cost model. So if you're going to have a vision, you're going to have a practice model, how do we fund it? What does it look like? What's the cost? What are we going to be asking people to procure? What are we going to purchase? What are we going to buy? And to really be clear about what that looks like. I think that has been one of the difficulties. And then the next one is the development of the RFP. If I have a practice model and a finance model, then I can put a good RFP together, because there I'm going to outline the roles and responsibilities of the department. I'm going to outline the roles and responsibilities of the vendor. I'm going to use data and matrix to guarantee, and then I'm going to pay according to how you do the work. And then finally, I'm going to use data as a basis for saying whether or not you're being successful or not. Whether or not only is the vendor being successful, but is the system being successful. And that's one of the things that we don't talk about here in other systems.
RFP needs to be detailed and defined. If you were rewriting the RFP with St. Francis, what changes would you make?
Well, see, it all would be based on what we envision the Nebraska child welfare system to be. That's what it would be based on. A lot of the things I think in the initial RFP, and again, I'm not knocking the work that was being done, and I want to be clear about that. I'm not knocking it, I was not here. But I think, one of the things that we want to give rise to is the work that we're asking people to do exactly what we want them to do to support the system? There were some performance outcomes in there, but is that actually what we're asking them to do?
Would you have made changes then in a future RFP? Would you make it more detailed?
Absolutely. Be more prescriptive.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, is anything else?
Nothing
All
from me,
right.
thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Thank you for being here, and this is helpful to the committee. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you for having me.
Yep. With that, we're going to take a 10-minute break, and we will resume with Mr. Botello.
Yeah, I don't think I
Did
did.
the pilot fail or not? Could we do better?
Okay, we are ready to resume our hearing today, and Mr. Botello, you are next. And so as we begin here, I would like you to raise your right hand. And, do you swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give to this committee is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Great. You may begin.
Good morning, Mr. Botello. I think you were present for Ms. Smith's testimony this morning, but I'll just repeat myself a little bit here. As you know, my name is Marnie Jensen. I'm special counsel to the LR29 committee. As with Ms. Smith, I'll ask that you try to keep your responses direct, succinct, wherever possible. And again, if I interrupt you, it's merely to keep the hearing going. As I think Chairman Arch noted at the outset, because Ms. Smith, I think, gave those overarching comments for DHHS, I'm going to skip the 5 to 10 minute opening remarks for you. You will have an opportunity at the end of the questioning if there's anything else you'd like to cover or offer. So I will give you that opportunity. So we will just jump right into the questions here. Mr. Botello, what is your position at the Department of Health and Human Services?
General counsel.
And what roles have you had there? If you could just assign dates for ease of the record.
Yes, from July 2017 to August 2018, Chief Operating Officer. From August 2018 to September 2020, Chief Operating Officer and General Counsel. From September 2020 to present, General Counsel. From October 2018 to September 2019, Interim Public Health Director. And from October 2018 to February 2019, Interim CEO.
Thank you. What was your previous experience prior to DHHS? You don't have to give your whole resume, but generally, especially as it relates to procurement.
I was in the Department of Administrative Services.
And what was your background with respect to Nebraska's procurement process, especially as it related to that position with DAS?
I was general counsel through most of my time there, as well as material administrator, which would be the individual supervising the state procurement office.
Fair to say you have a good understanding of the state's procurement process?
I would say so.
Okay. And what about your understanding of the state's procurement manual?
Yes, I have a fair understanding of that as well.
I'll ask you a similar question to what I asked Ms. Smith. You were provided some questions and topics in advance of the hearing, correct?
Yes,
And did you discuss those questions or topics with anyone outside the Department of DHHS?
no,
In particular, did you have any conversations with anyone at St. Francis Ministries about those questions or
No.
topics? I'm sorry, that was a no. I talked over you.
no, I did not, nor am I aware of anyone in the Department of Health and Human Services speaking with St. Francis about the questions provided.
Okay, thank you. And also, Mr. Botello, I think you had somewhat more direct involvement in responding to the committee's requests for information. So you're aware that DHHS received a request for information from the committee through council, correct?
Yes.
And what did you and maybe your general counsel department or council's office do to identify, review, and prepare documents to satisfy those requests?
When we got the requests from the committee, we reached out to the committee's counsel, yourself, and asked how you want to proceed with the record search. We identified search terms, which was provided to us by yourself, your law office. We ran an initial search in those terms to see what it would pick up. It was just shy of 1 million documents. We returned that back to you. You narrowed your search down to less search terms and may have narrowed a number of individuals as well. I can't remember. We then ran that search that came back to 90,000 responsive documents initially on the search terms. We pulled those documents. We reviewed all 90,000 documents and provided to the committee all those that were responsive to the actual request.
Thank you. And that, just for the sake of clarity of the record, that search process and that we entered into special counsel's office and your office, that was in addition to providing the committee with duplicative responses to every public records request relating to this issue. Is that correct?
That is correct. Any public record request or any other document request we provided to any entity, OIG, or to individuals regarding this, those were all identified in the committee, and those documents were all provided as well.
Are you aware of any instances where any responsive documents, and this is prior to receiving our request, would have been destroyed?
No.
Do you believe that the department has fully cooperated with the committee's request for information?
I believe so, yes.
In the event that there were additional requests for information, do you have any reason to believe that DHHS would not be able to cooperate?
No, absolutely not.
All right, thank you, Mr. Botello. I'm probably going to be a little more detailed in my questioning with respect to similar topics that we covered with Ms. Smith, but we'll start sort of in that same general timeline, which is the pre-bid process and that RFP process. What role did you play in the development of the RFP itself?
I was not involved in the development of the RFP.
Are you aware of whether anyone in DHHS was involved in the development of the RFP itself?
Yes.
Was someone from DHHS involved?
Yes.
I asked the question poorly, so I tried to fix it. Who was involved from DHHS?
The RFP, and this is generally how it works in the state of Nebraska, RFPs are developed usually by the bidding agency program. So in this case, the bidding agency was Department of Health and Human Services. Department of Health and Human Services has multiple divisions, and with a director, those divisions that are seeking the service will build the RFP. So it would have been the CFS programmatic folks. I don't know how many of them specifically were involved with it. As I understand it, it was a lengthy process, but you would have had your director, you would have had your deputy director, Lori, and I don't know how many other programmatic folks. They had a consultant for this RFP, Stevens Group. There would have been at least one buyer, agency buyer, which had been from the procurement office, involved helping to get the information and putting it into an RFP format. I don't know if DAS's buyer would have been involved in all of those, but at some point, once the RFP got to where we thought it was sufficient to move to DAS, it would have been moved to a DAS buyer, and then DAS would have done a review to make sure it fits the template and it conforms with their requirements.
And at the time that the RFP was issued, you were the interim CEO, correct?
I might have been.
So did you have, understanding you weren't maybe at that ground level in terms of development of the RFP, as you just described, did you have final sign off as the agency, as interim CEO?
It would have come from the director. In this case, it would have been Matt Wallen.
Okay. I'm going to ask you some similar questions that we heard Ms. Smith's testimony on this morning. I would like, you were at DHHS for some period of time before CEO Smith took the reins. And so I would like for you to describe, in your view, the relationship between DHHS and Promise Ship. And I'll limit it to in the time, a couple of years immediately preceding the RFP.
Promise Ship is a large vendor, and it was, or in the Eastern Service Area in general, is a unique relationship. It's a subaward in that it's a pass-through, but it's really more of a staff aug type of agreement. They're not a true, or what you would call a traditional awardee, because they're not simply providing services on their own behalf. They there are augmenting state resources. So they're a direct agent of the state, but they're not providing services to the state like a commercial contract would. They're providing services to the public as, in essence, state agents under their own name, promiseship. So I think I think that's a very difficult relationship in any situation. If you have a private entity that seeks to do things the way it thinks it would be best for them to do it. However, they are in fact agents of the state and representing the state directly with families and in the court. And so the state wants them to do things, the way that they would do it, that's consistent with what's going on with the rest of the state, which is where every other service area, the eastern service area is done by the state, and we're trying to maintain consistency throughout the service area. So I think there's, I don't know how you would describe it. I don't know if we use the word tense, but there's a lot of moving back and forth in that relationship.
Do you agree that the relationship was strained? I think that's what CEO Smith, that was her word this morning.
I guess I couldn't disagree with that if that's how it's being characterized.
And the Stephen Group report characterized that relationship as existing in a culture of distrust. Do you agree with that characterization?
I wouldn't disagree with it.
And I think you were actually, in your answers, using the term, I think you referred to promiseship as a large vendor. And with respect to that characterization of promiseship and its role as a vendor or a subgrantee, or now, in your words, sort of staff augmentation arm of the state, do you have any response to maybe the characterization that confusion of what they're really supposed to be led to that culture with the state and promiseship?
Yeah, I would say that, it does. It's unique, in my opinion. Are they an independent contractor? No, they can't be. They can't by simply by the services they're providing. But for a private entity, that's an organization. Typically when you do staff aug, it's with an individual, right? You're reaching out to an individual and you're going to contract that person to provide services. In this relationship, you're contracting with an independent entity to provide, in essence, individual services. So I would say, yeah, it's that structure, that how it's designed is one that's going to be difficult to manage.
And would you agree that that would be true regardless of who was selected as a result of the RFP?
Yes, the structure itself is difficult to manage.
With respect to the RFP, I'm going to ask two questions here, one specific to you and one specific to the department, and you as interim CEO at the time. Did anyone, to your knowledge, well, I'll ask the more narrow question first. Did you affirmatively contact any potential entities to provide RFP responses?
No.
Did, to your knowledge, anyone at DHHS contact potential entities to submit RFP responses?
DHHS submitted a vendor list to DAS and asked that DAS send the RFP to those entities on the list. And that's typical. DAS will ask the bidding agency, are there any vendors you want us to send the RFP to? That agency will provide vendors that they're aware of. Those DAS should then send a copy of the RFP to that vendor or the vendors on the list, as well as the required publication on its website and I think newspaper publication as well.
In this instance with the RFP that resulted in St. Francis being awarded the contract, was that vendor list provided?
Yeah, as far as I know, yes.
And how many vendors were on the list?
12.
Was St. Francis on the list?
No.
Was Promise on the list?
Yes. The incumbent should always get an RFP.
I'll ask you generally, Mr. Botello, when that vendor list is prepared, is there any work, I'm not even going to use the word diligence, but even just a modicum amount of work that goes into determining whether the entities that appear on the vendor list would be appropriate partners? Or is it merely like, I would characterize it as sort of a Google search, here's 12 people that might want to respond. I'm kind of wondering sort of where that balance is.
I mean, I'm sure there's a range of effort that goes into preparing vendor lists. I mean, typically what you want to do is you want to try to identify vendors that you believe are in the market and that you would like or hope to solicit a bid from.
Regardless of, but it sounds like you are not aware of any affirmative overtures to St. Francis to submit a response to the RFP based on your testimony already. Setting that aside, are you aware of whether there were any communications between St. Francis and the department prior to St. Francis's RFP response?
St. Francis would have been a vendor, so they would have had to have been interactions with them as a vendor, say, much like there would have been interactions with Promise-ship as, a vendor of the state. There should not have been communications regarding the RFP, or no more communications that would have been available to the public that were published.
And you're not aware of any, as you said?
I am not.
And when you say St. Francis was a vendor, that's in reference to the work they were already doing in the Western?
Yeah, Grand Island, I think, they're child placing agency.
So moving on to the decision-making process more generally, and these will be repetitive, but I do want to be thorough for the committee's investigatory work here. What was your understanding as interim CEO at the outset of the RFP, and then as, I believe, COO and General Counsel throughout 2019, regarding which agency bore the ultimate responsibility for the fairness and legality of the RFP process?
So DAS is statutorily empowered, entrusted with state procurement process. Chapter 81 is the much older set of statutes, and those speak to goods and commodities and specifically invest that power into DAS. Chapter 73, which is the newest set of statutes, came out in 2003, which then created the service statutes and directed DAS to create a procurement manual, and the procurement manual in itself regulates the procurement of services. It also empowers state agencies to procure it on their own, but they have to follow the DAS process. So ultimately, the procurement process itself, the integrity of the process is the responsibility of DAS to protect that. It's the obligation of the bidding agencies to follow that process.
Do you believe that the bidding agency, and in particular this RFP process, had any responsibility for assisting DAS in that responsibility, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think it has to be. DAS is relying on the bidding, one, to provide the RFP. DAS doesn't have the technical expertise to generate an RFP for a specific service to which it doesn't provide. It would have no institutional knowledge. So it's relying on the bidding agency to create the RFP and then to provide it to DAS. The bidding agency is the one that typically identify the evaluators. The evaluation process is monitored by DAS, but it's the agency's evaluators that would evaluate the response. Those responses are, generally in the Nebraska system, they're using a scoring method. They're attaching numerical value to the different sections of the RFP. Those are submitted to DAS, they're added up, and a final score is provided.
So DHHS identified the evaluators.
Yes.
And so ultimately, I'll just ask it as I did colloquially this morning, which agency, practically speaking, do you believe, the buck stops with regarding the ultimate award recipient?
So the bidding agency is going to make a recommendation for an award based on the evaluations that it receives. It's going to take the scores, it's going to take the bids, it's going to consume that, it's going to make a recommendation to DAS for its intent to award. DAS, I would say, would typically accept that recommendation unless it has a reason not to.
Have, in your experience, which is a lot, certainly more than mine, have you ever seen an instance where DAS has not taken the recommendation of the bidding agency?
Yes.
How many times?
I can recall as material administrator doing it at least once.
And I don't need the details of that. I'll ask another question. With a contract of this size, which I think we can all agree is substantial expenditure of state funds, have you ever seen DAS reject the bidding agency's recommendation?
So can I
Sure.
explain a little bit? So DAS is probably not going to go in and reevaluate. They're just simply not going to be able to do that. So if they find an error in the recommendation, like for instance, agency submits 3 vendors, you have your high score, middle, low score. Agency wants to award to number 2 vendor, which is not the high scoring vendor. DS is probably not going to accept that recommendation unless there's a reason why you're not going to award to the number 1 vendor. So if there's something like that, if there's sort of this plain error, or the recommendation would appear to violate the process, again, DAS is going to protect their process, then they would not comply. But they're simply not going to be able to switch their judgment for the bidding agency. Technically, under the statute, they probably could, but practically, I don't know how or why they would do that, unless it's, again, it's clearly a procedural process that they can identify.
Thank you for that clarification. So we know where this question is coming from here, but so for instance, if the second highest bidder or the second score, in terms of scoring, were to be selected or recommended, that would have to come with some explanation in terms of that recommendation. Is that fair?
Yes.
Still speaking sort of generally and based on your experience with the state's procurement process, can you explain the difference between what is considered a responsive bid and an unresponsive bid?
A responsive bid is one that generally purports to provide the goods or services which the state's seeking.
Is there anywhere that the committee can look to find a definition or some guidance on responsiveness?
So the procurement model defines, not the procurement model, the procurement manual defines responsive bid as one that complies with solicitations in all material respects and contains no material defects. So that's where you would go.
And so then a non-responsive bid would be the opposite of that. I think we can assume that it maybe contains a material defect or it doesn't comply with the mandatory terms of the RFP. Is that fair?
Yes. Although the process accepts or allows for deviations, but yes.
And we may get into some of those deviations. Now, speaking of the manual and material defects, I think the manual defines a material defect as one that affects term, price, quality, quantity, or delivery terms. I think that's a quote, but you can correct me.
Yes, I believe that's correct.
Is that the definition of a material defect that DHHS used as it related to the award to St. Francis?
That would be the definition that's in their procurement manual.
So would DHHS have applied any other definition or standard with respect to material defect, to your knowledge?
No.
Do you agree that a contract can only be awarded to a bidder who is deemed responsive?
Generally, yes. And although the process, the RFPs lays out conditions that's saying, this is what we want you to respond to. The RFP says that you can submit it, you can give us something else. You can submit a deviation. You can bid something other than what we're asking for. The state reserves the right to consider that deviation. If the state doesn't explicitly accept the deviation per the RFP, the deviation is rejected and the state takes position that the RFP condition prevails. So if I'm asking for X and you say Y, I can accept Y, or in the words of the RFP, I can assume your Y is X. Because the RFP becomes, and this is part of the reason why the state contracts are so massive, because they're designed so that the RFP, which is the bidding document, becomes part of the contract. And if there's conflicting terminology between the response and the RFP, the state's position is, and always has been since I've been here, that the RFP language prevails unless we specifically accept the deviation.
So with respect to that option, I guess, that the state would have, would the RFP respondent necessarily know whether the deviation had been accepted or whether the state was just assuming that the bidding agency was like following the RFP, I guess?
That's the purpose of the final negotiation, or the, I forget the exact, what the name is in the procurement manual, but that's why.
Contract finalization.
Yes, that's why that meeting is so important, especially if there were deviations, right? I mean, technically, the state could simply execute the contract and try to stand on the terms of the bidding document, which is going to create a lot of conflict between the state and the vendor, and probably would increase the amount of litigation. But that contract finalization is important, because if there is a deviation that was evaluated and scored, then that has to either be accepted or rejected. And should be, in my opinion, explicitly. Signing the contract and then trying to hold a vendor to a condition in the RFP, even though they bid something different, would be a bad practice.
So speaking specifically about the St. Francis intent to award an ultimate contract, really with respect to its RFP response, do you believe that the St. Francis initial RFP response had any material defects?
The initial response, I think what you're referring to is the case load probably, right? Appeared to have been, the way it was worded, appeared to have been a ratio that would not have met the statutory requirement, which is the 17-1. But at the same time, they said they would abide by all relevant applicable statutes and regulations. In the Q&A period, we specifically said, this is because we've got a question on this specifically. And that was put out there. This is the ratio. You have to abide by the ratio. So they submit a bid that in the technical solution did not appear that it would meet that statutory requirement. But in the terms and conditions section, they agreed to abide by all applicable statutes. So you had this ambiguity from what they were saying that we're going to abide by this and what appeared to be in their technical solution, which the state would interpret as a deviation and scored accordingly.
So, and just so I'm clear, because the terms matter for the committee's work with respect to really analyzing the procurement process itself, you would characterize that caseload ratio response from St. Francis as a deviation and not a material defect?
It was, if they were going to say that this is our bid, this is the only bid that we're going to do, then I would say it's a material defect and the state couldn't award it, right? But the state evaluated it, and at that point, if the state evaluates it, it's, to me, that's a deviation. Or at least it was accepted as a deviation in the evaluation process.
Thank you. Was there discussion, well, so at least one evaluator noted this discrepancy in their evaluation notes. This, I think you just laid out that in one instance, it said 25-1, but then they separately said, St. Francis said we would comply, right? So with that notation, was that conflict or discrepancy discussed as part of the recommendation process that DHHS was going through?
So when the evaluators completed their evaluation and the scores were all in, at that point, the bids in the evaluations would have been provided to the program, and they would have been reviewed by the director and the deputies and the staff, and they would have considered all the information, and including at that point reviewing the bids. Even though you had your scores in, the bids would have likely been reviewed. And so I would say that it should have been. Although, I mean, it's unclear what exactly St. Francis was saying, because they were saying two things. Their technical solution didn't appear that it would meet the statutory requirements, but then they said they were going to meet the statutory requirements.
Okay, and we're going to talk a lot about cost. So I'm saying that only because I'm going to ask you just a few more caseload questions, but noting, Mr. Patella, we will come back to that in a lot more detail. So kind of trying to constrain us a little bit here, but just a few more questions while we're talking about this area. The 25-1 caseload ratio that was originally proposed by St. Francis, do you believe at the outset that that affected the price that St. Francis was proposing to do the work for?
I would assume that their cost was based on whatever their proposal was.
And do you think that that would, that 25-1 proposal would also have potentially had an impact on the quality of the services that were proposed by St. Francis at the outset?
I'm not quite sure I understand.
So and maybe I should ask it a little differently. 25-1 in a caseload ratio, as opposed to say 15-1, do you think that that is going to have an impact on quality of services provided? That caseload ratio directly correlates to quality?
Yes, you mean it would the manner in which they were proposing to conduct the service have impacted the quality of the services actually rendered? Yes.
And again, I noted we're going to come back to more detailed questions on cost. But I'm really just focused on St. Francis's original RFP response at this stage of the questioning. So in reviewing St. Francis's response to the RFP, what did DHHS understand about the proposal relating to the percentage of services that St. Francis proposed to provide directly? Did you have an understanding of that proposal, what they were going to do directly?
They would have evaluated whatever was in the proposal, right?
Well, okay, so let me lay maybe a little bit more groundwork here. So you're familiar with the statutory requirements
Yes.
relating to the 35%?
Yes.
Okay, and so just to be clear, there is a statutory requirement that the lead agency may not directly provide more than 35% of direct services under the contract.
Correct.
Okay, so when DHHS saw that original proposal, did you have an understanding about what percentage of services would be provided directly by the lead agency?
I didn't evaluate the proposals, but the evaluators would have seen whatever St. Francis put in there and scored it accordingly. I think I can't remember verbatim what St. Francis put in there, but I don't think they put a lot of detail in there, if that's what we're talking about. But then again, they agreed to comply with all statutory and regulatory compliance requirements. So whatever was in the proposal was what those evaluators would have evaluated and scored.
Yes, so I'll represent to you. It sounds like the answer to my question is no, you don't recall what St. Francis put in with respect to that direct services, and that's okay. It's not a memory test here this morning still. But St. Francis had originally submitted, I think, a 50-50, so that 50% of the services would be direct and 50% would be contracted. That's at least one reading of the RFP proposal. So I'll ask it differently. In that context, assuming that's true, that the RFP response had proposed a 50-50, do you think that would have had an impact on their costs?
Their costs would have been based on their bid. I honestly, I don't know where the 50-50 is coming from, because I never found that in the bid. Or
Yeah, and you may not have seen it. It is in an email from an individual, Diane Carver. Do you know Ms. Carver? I think she's a vice president at St. Francis, and that went to Ross Manhart. Do you know Mr. Manhart?
I do know who Ross is.
And he's an employee, or at least was at the time, of DHHS, correct?
Yes, he is.
And so St. Francis had indicated, Ms. Carver had indicated that the department accepted our bid of utilizing direct and purchased services, which was a 50-50 cost proposal. Do you have any familiarity with that 50-50 cost proposal?
No, and I don't think that was in their bid. And regardless, if it even was in their bid, or that's how they want to interpret their proposal, it would not be in accordance with state statute or regulation, which they were bound to abide by.
I think the answer is assumed in your other answers, but do you recall any conversations within DHHS about either Ms. Carver's email specifically or more generally, that there was some concern that St. Francis was presuming a 50-50 cost proposal?
No, I don't.
All right, let's move on from cost for a short amount of time and talk about the performance bond requirement. The RFP itself required the winning bidder to supply a performance bond. Is that true?
Yes.
And do you recall the amount of that performance bond?
$1 million?
I think that's correct. I think that's page 13, and at least my notes indicate that. So $1 million performance bond. Mr. Botello, just for the committee's information and not to insult anyone else's intelligence, but so that we're using the same terminology, what is a performance bond?
Yeah, that's a good question. A performance bond is it's a type of risk mitigation. It's issued by a surety company, and basically what the surety company is putting up is a fixed number of dollars, in this case $1 million, to ensure that the vendor complies with the contract. Surety companies are more interested, they're an insurance company. They don't necessarily want to pay out the $1 million. In many cases, they will offer specific performance. If the state, as the holder of the bond, says, hey, there's been a breach of the contract, we're damaged, we want the money, surety companies would generally try to fix the problem before they pay the money out. Which is really useful in construction contracts, not always applicable in other more complex contracts. If that can't be done, then they'll make a determination as whether or not there was an actual breach, and then they would pay up to that amount of money based on what the bondholder can show their damages to be. So it is there to offer protection to the bondholder in hopes of ensuring that the services that are contracted for are actually performed, and if not, there's something there to mitigate damages.
There's been some question raised, before we get into the actual submission of the performance bond, there's been some question raised, I think, relating to whether $1 million is an appropriate amount of a performance bond for a contract of this size. Do you have any response to that? Just
$1 million would, I mean, if you want to look at the total risk of a contract this size, and this is where performance bonds sometimes fall short, right? The amount of money to cover all potential risk or damage to the state for a contract for this, for a complete failure, I mean, that would be a huge amount of money, which is going to require a lot of cost on the part of vendors to get it, if they can get it. So it's hard. I mean, the state builds risk mitigation into its contracts, insurance requirements, performance bond, other means to protect the state, but you can never eliminate all that risk, and it would be difficult to do so with a performance bond. So that was part of what the state was considering with how much money, knowing that you probably couldn't cover everything, but you wanted something, and you didn't want the bond itself to be prohibitive to potential vendors.
Is the performance bond a statutory requirement?
I don't think it is.
With respect to the performance bond, the RFP, I think there was a question. Must the $1 million performance bond be secured for proposal or upon award? And the answer was, it must be obtained prior to contract execution. Do you recall that part of the RFP?
Yes, it's not a bid bond, so it's not required for the purpose of submitting a bid. It's a requirement of the contract.
And so in your view, would not having a performance bond prior to the contract execution be considered a material defect?
a material, it wouldn't be a material defect of the bid. It would be, I would say, non-compliance with the contractual terms, right? I think if you look at the DAS process, when it comes to certificate of insurance or performance bonds, they request that sent to them, I think, prior to where they would execute the contract, or proof that the bond is in existence or the insurance is there prior to the execution of the contract.
Did St. Francis provide a performance bond?
Yes,
Was that performance bond provided prior to the contract execution?
I looked at the bond. The bond was executed July 1, 2019? July 1, 2019. So yes, they had a bond prior to execution. The execution of the contract was on, I think you had said previously, was July 3rd.
So, and I really do just want to understand this performance bond issue, Mr. Botello, because frankly, I don't do a lot of work with performance bonds. So I just want to understand, when I reviewed the information provided relating to the performance bond, it appeared to me, at least, that it was not provided to the state until February of 2020, but that it was dated July 1, 2019. Can you clarify that at all for the committee?
No, July, I mean, if the bond is dated July 1, so that means the bond was in effect July 1. It should have been provided to the state shortly after it was executed.
So if it was, I guess, and because I really do sort of want to get past that question of the performance bond with respect to this RFP, it would be sufficient in your mind, as long as that performance bond was in place prior to the execution of the contract, whether the state had a copy or not, as long as it was in place, would you surmise that then, I guess, complied with the contract?
Yes, if they had an effective bond and it was effective prior to the execution of the contract and the state had what it needed, the state should have a copy of that bond. But if the bond was in existence and valid, then they've complied with that condition of the contract.
That performance bond that we've seen had an effective date, again, of July 1, 2019, and that went through June 20, 2020 with the option for an extension. I just want to make sure, as we sit here today, does St. Francis have a performance bond in place?
Yes,
And is that still in compliance with the contract? It's $1 million.
it's a new contract now.
Right.
So it's whatever the terms and conditions of the emergency contract are, the bond it should comply with that.
Do you have any information that St. Francis is not in compliance with the performance bond requirements under the emergency contract?
I do not.
In fact, do you believe they are in
I
compliance?
do.
All right, I'd like to talk a little bit about reasonableness. Do you agree that the RFP in this instance allowed the state to review bids for reasonableness of cost?
The RFP process, Nebraska relies on the RFP process to, in part, make that determination of reasonableness. It generally relies on that process. And so the result of the RFP is sort of deemed reasonable unless there's a reason to question that. It's how I would describe that.
Do you believe that DHHS, in making its recommendation on the RFP, had any obligation to consider the reasonableness of St. Francis's bid?
Yes,
And do you believe DHHS did that?
yes.
What does reasonable mean in this context to DHHS?
I mean, reasonable would mean rational, fair. You would look at ordinary and a normal course, sensible.
Is there any place the committee can look to find a definition or some guidance on reasonableness?
I mean, yeah, you got, what, 200-300 years of Anglo-American case law based on this sort of quasi-judicial definition of reasonable. It's not defined in the procurement manual, I don't think, like responsiveness and those other elements are. It's sort of implied, but there is no reasonable task that's defined in the procurement manual or in statutes. It's sort of inherent out of the Chapter 181 commodity statutes that were pulled over into the service side by the DAS procurement manual.
Other than the words that you just provided, rational, fair, normal, normal course, sensible, is there any guidance that exists within DHHS that when DHHS is examining bids or procurement issues where we can look to see what reasonable means? Understanding it's not on the procurement manual like some of the other terms. Have you developed anything within DHHS?
I have not.
Are you aware of anything that has been developed within DHHS?
No, not to address that specifically.
Do you think that the Stephen Group report and findings had some role to play in testing for reasonableness as it relates to St. Francis's bid?
I don't know.
I'm going to ask you just a few. Let me ask you a threshold question. Have you reviewed the Stephen Group's report?
I have reviewed it, but it's been a while. And I don't think it's not something that I read or necessarily applied to anything, but I have seen it.
With respect, that's helpful. So if you just don't know the answers to the questions, I'm going to ask you're under oath, be honest, so you don't know, and we'll move on. But I do want to kind of test your own memory of that review on the Stephen Group findings, if we could. So the Stephen Group found that there were no areas in terms of cost or outcomes in which promiseship was an outlier over all state results. Do you remember that finding? Do you remember seeing that finding?
Not specifically, but I do know. I don't.
Knowing everything that you know about the relationship, about the providing of services that promiseship did to the state, do you disagree with that finding sitting here? That promiseship was generally in line with all state results, complete state results?
As far as child welfare and I think I would agree with that.
Okay, and what about with respect to cost? It said cost or outcomes. Do you think promiseship leading into the RFP was in line with other state costs?
The impression that I had from the program was that the costs were high in the Eastern Service area.
What was that understanding? What was the basis for that understanding?
the programmatic understanding. I
That
imagine
costs were high. I mean, I want to know why, what was the basis for you to understand that Promise Ship's costs were high?
that's just what was communicated to me in talking with the CFS program and those folks.
Okay. Any detail at all given on what costs were high or why they thought costs were high, or any other detail with respect to that?
I know they monitored costs in all the other service areas. So I would imagine it was based on what they knew their cost was elsewhere.
I've seen some indicators, some support that for 2017, Promise Ship's cost per case per month was actually less, like $300 less than the state's own costs in those 4 other regions. Do you have any information with respect to that? And that was 2017.
I did not.
And then I'll ask about 2018, because the information that the committee has been provided is that in 2018, Promise Ship's cost per case per month was within $100 of the state's own costs. And that was approximately $100 more, but still within $100. Any information that you have with respect to that?
I did not.
Were there discussions within, and again, we're going to spend some time, I think, later on in your testimony relating to the request for an additional $15 million and that clarification meeting. So I'm not asking you to go into that quite yet, but were there discussions upon, receiving St. Francis's bid about, just the realism, is this a realistic bid for these services that are going to be provided? Understanding that differential between Promise Ship and St. Francis. Did you have conversations about, wow, 40% is a lot of difference?
I believe so. When the evaluation was completed and the scores and the bids were provided to CFS, they looked at both bids in light of the scores, and they would have considered the bids in their entirety. And obviously there was an obvious difference in cost that would have been considered as well.
Was there any substantive evaluation within DHHS once you got the evaluators report, I guess, and notes and comments? Was there substantive discussion within DHHS to try to determine what was driving that 40% differential?
I don't know specifically if there was an attempt to differentiate that in that manner. Not that I'm aware of.
And I know Chairman Arch wants to break around noon, but I think I will try to cover one more topic, which hopefully we can do and sort of stay on schedule with our lunch break. I want to talk about due diligence. And there was some discussion this morning with Ms. Smith relating to this media review. And I'm going to ask the question maybe on most people's minds. Was there more than one media review conducted in this RFP process?
So I know CO Smith asked for, or asked Matt, who was the communication director at the time, to do a media search. I know that occurred. And if I recall, I think when the protest was filed, there may have been information provided with the protest as well that would have had other media articles, or at least was raised in the protest.
So at our break, I placed a document on the table there in front of you, Mr. Botello. It's sitting right on top of that binder. Right there, yep. This was a document that was provided to us in conjunction with the promiseship litigation that resulted after the protest by promiseship was denied. This has been, I think, at least for me as special counsel, what we believed was the media review. Is that your characterization of that document? Maybe that will clear up Senator Coulterman's question as well from the earlier testimony.
The media review that CO Smith was talking about, I don't think this is that media review. I think her media review that she got was a collection of news articles. I don't think this is it.
Okay, we may spend a little time over lunch trying to sort that out a little bit more. But since you have the document in front of you, is that something that was provided to you prior to the signing of the contract with St. Francis?
I don't specifically recognize this document. I know we did an internal media review, which was reviewed. I know there was information raised in the protest, and that would have been reviewed and considered in conjunction with the protest. I can't say one way or another. If it was provided to us, it would have been reviewed.
And I will share with you the document that is sitting in front of you. It is, I believe, the document that Senator Coulterman was referring to earlier, where there are media and other reports of children, being housed in a corporate office and sleeping on the floor. And so I just am trying to clear up that confusion for folks today. So maybe over the lunch hour,
I can
I
try
would
to
ask
find out.
maybe for you to try to clarify that so that we have, accurate information as a committee in terms of what was provided. The real question is, what information was provided to DHHS prior to the signing of the contract with respect to St. Francis's performance or other issues from other states? That's what I would like you to, if you wouldn't mind over lunch, look at. With that, it might be a good time to break before I move into the next topic.
Sure, let's do that. We will break for lunch and we will resume the hearing at 1 o'clock.